Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to our continuating discussion on the rise of absolutism in Europe during the 1600s. Isn't that right, PP? You're like basically an absolutist because you rule this power with divine right? So the big thing about it is, though, okay, really, you're gonna kick my computer like that? There we go. So we're gonna pick up right where we left off what we were talking about in class, right? We were talking about in class today. After a really fantastic class where we actually spent most of our time talking about this. Exactly, right? We spent a lot of time talking about the 30 Years' War, its violence, right? Guns, weaponry, how it's all going to change, and all this other big stuff. We talked about the big phases of the 30 Years' War, right? Bohemian, Danish, Swedish, and French. We talked about Gustavus Adolphus and how he's going to change the face of modern-day military and stuff like that. But then we also briefly took a little bit of time today, too, to talk about the elements of an absolutist government, right? We talked about bureaucratic systems, centralization, and divine right authority, right? Now, the biggest thing out of all of those descriptors, bureaucracy, centralization, divine right authority, the biggest thing to remember out of the three of those things is that divine right one, right? You should definitely highlight divine right to rule more than anything else in that entire system. Because did even constitutional systems have a bureaucratic system? Yes. Did even constitutional systems have a centralized government that was ruled from one location? Yes, they did. All right. So, but the big thing that makes a difference out of the absolutist and the constitutional government is that divine right authority and complete and sole authority resting in the hands of one centralized monarch, right? But the other big thing that you need to understand is that, speaking of things that some of these leaders also share, is that other practical elements of government and government leadership during the 1600s is going to fall into a lot of different little categories. So the next three things that we're about to talk about are going to be things that all different kinds of leaders actually share, right? Absolutist governments and absolutist governments. As governments began to grow and noble power and other noble vestiges and noble governmental powers are going to actually leave their hands and move more towards the monarchs and kings. Now remember, monarchs, kings, same thing, right? So we're going to use that word interchangeably. There are going to be common elements between all of them, right? Constitutional rulers like the Stuarts or like Elizabeth the First, the Tudor Queen of England. She's going to even have some elements of these things as well, right? So with that, though, one of the big ones that they're all going to share is the creation of what's known as professional armies, right? Or professional militaries. I know I talked a lot about this with Stella when she was doing a lot of her research on Prussia. By the way, again, we're going to need to make sure that we finish our maps and stuff like that before open house. So, getting into it, though, in general, growth of professional militaries is going to be a really big deal. So, looking at this entire thing, what is the difference between a professional military and the ones that have come before them, right? Well, the thing about it is, before the establishment of growing governments and centralized authorities and centralized bodies in the 1600s, militaries were actually raised in a very inconvenient and non-efficient way, right? Thank you, I love you too. So the big thing about it, though, is way they're going to be actually raised is a king would typically, during the Middle Ages and going into the 14 and 1500s, would would send courtiers or emissaries out to nobles, right? They would send word out to nobles like the Tuttles and the Frews and the Letefas and all these other major families that are around at the time, and would say, send me your vassals and bring me your knights, right? So basically, the ability for a king to raise a military during those time periods relied completely on the nobles liking them and showing up when they were asked, right? So the difference, though, is that in the 1600s, leaders are going to start turning instead to raising militaries professionally, right? And what does that mean? That means that they have a formal army that is built year around and is paid, right? They're all going to start wearing common uniforms, having common weapons, having common pay, having common diets and rationing and things like that. And basically it's going to be the creation of what you know as a military in the modern sense, right? And what's going to happen because of that professionalization of the military is army sizes are going to triple. They're going to get absolutely massive. And so a big thing that ends up happening is a lot of these governments all over Europe are going to basically start racing each other to to try and figure out who's going to have the bigger army that's going to be able to fight the biggest war, that's going to be able to win the biggest battles, right? Now, other big things that are going to be happening during this time period as well, just in the back of your mind that you need to always be remembering, is there's this movement going on right now called the Scientific Revolution in the 1600s. Technically, it actually began in the 1450s under this guy named Nicholas Copernicus. But the big thing about it to understand is the scientific revolution is happening in the background of absolutism, right? They're happening at the exact same time. Major figures like Galileo is going to actually die during the 30 Years' War. Not because of the war, but he actually dies under house arrest. It's a big different thing. Also, Isaac Newton is going to rise up under the Stuart monarchy in England, like in the late 1600s and stuff like that. So the scientific revolution is going on during this time period. Now, the big thing that you need to understand is monarchs during this time period, whether they be constitutional or absolutist, are going to support the growth of science, right? They're going to support the growth of science, open up scientific academies and things like that. Examples of those include the Paris Academy of Sciences, the Russian Academy of Sciences. I know, Panzavecki, I know you're freaking out about the Russian anything, all right? So, but like, yeah, the Russians had an Academy of Sciences. The other big thing that's going to even go down as well is the Royal Academy or the Royal Society that is going to be built up in England as well. So support of the sciences is a really, really big thing. Now, does this have direct, I don't want to listen to the church conflict ingrained in it? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on the monarch that you're talking about. A lot of them are just supporting modernization because with science comes modernization, comes better infrastructure, right? So another big thing, though, that all these leaders are doing, whether they are constitutional or whether they are absolutist, is they are supporting the destruction of noble power, right? For example, the noble in my house is my wife, right? She is definitely this noble that controls all this different stuff, and she's looking at me right now as if I'm like a turd or whatever. But I have to do my best to reduce her power so I can have more, right? Because I'm the monarch. I'm the king of this castle. Isn't that right, sweetheart? She said this is a matriarchy, actually, not a patriarchy, which is actually pretty true. She really does run the show. If anything, she's the queen, and I'm some, like, noble, and she wants to replace me with this dinky noble right here, Mr. Peepee. All right, so now look.
You're a peasant.
I'm a peasant? No. Katie Scuderi is a peasant. What?
Fief?
A fief is a plot of land, sweetheart. A person is not a fief.
Fiefdom?
A fiefdom is also another plot of land.
Oh, what are they called? Serfs?
Serfs. I'm a serf. There you go.
Serf.
Look at that. My wife even knows what a serf is, right? It's not my wife even. I'm not saying like she wasn't supposed to know it or whatever. I'm just saying she's wicked smart, and that knowing what a serf is very important in modern day society.
Yeah, so I can insult you.
Yeah, so she can insult me and call me a serf, right? But it's okay, Scuderi, we all know that you're the serf, and so is Rodriguez. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is when we're looking at this thing as well, I love you. So, like, now, big thing, though, about it as well is we're going to focus our, like, actual, like, look, our magnifying glass, our first large, like, look at an absolutist monarchy in France, right? So let's go ahead and start off with the Bourbons, right? So the Bourbons are going to become the biggest monarchical family and the absolute monarchy family that is going to exist in France, right? So with that, you got to understand some little elements of these different ideas, right? So the Bourbons are going to come to power under none other than Henry IV. Now remember, we talked about Henry IV already. Henry IV is the guy that waged the 4th through the 7th French Wars of Religion, right? I know that Olivia remembered that really well when we came in. We talked about it, but we had to make sure because Olivia called me out on my mix-up and stuff like that. And like in my last flip, Henry IV is that same guy that converted from Protestantism to Catholicism, then converted back again. Because remember, never forget that Paris is worth a mass, right? Henry IV is going to become the leader of the French royalty and going to become the king of France, and he's also going to be known as Henry the Great for his ability to stop the French wars of religion and to pass a very important document known as the Edict of Nantes. And the Edict of Nantes, of course, said that Protestants could freely practice if they so chose, and that no city in Paris or in France should be suppressing the practice of any other religion, right? So the other big thing that you need to understand about it is his wife's name is Marie de Medici. Wait a minute, not Margaret? Some of you are like, wait a minute, I'm confused. I understand Paris is worth a mass and all that stuff, and that this guy wrote the Edict of Nantes and that he brought like an end to a lot of very long periods of violence in like France, but I thought he was married to Margaret, not Marie. Well, the thing about it is after he becomes king, after he becomes Henry IV of France, he actually annuls his marriage to Margaret Valois because he's not having any children with her, and instead gets married to a different woman named Marie de Medici, who apparently is not one of the brightest bulbs in the box, and she's also very annoying, according to many different sources and many different people, right? The big thing about it, though, in general, is that he does end up having several children with Marie de Medici, and going forward, the other big thing that you need to know is that he's very famous for saying saying, I refuse to rule over a country that does not have a chicken in every pot, right? So a big thing about Henry is he is going to come along and he's going to directly act in some very deliberate ways to try and curry favor with the poor, right? So we have some of our like poorer populations of people in Europe who aren't eating as often. The little ice age is ending and stuff like that. The famines of the 30 Years' War are going to be a really big deal. But when Henry comes to power, the 30 Years' War hasn't even started yet, right? He actually dies in 1610, and then of course what's going to end up happening by 1618 is the 30 Years' War is going to begin. But he is in power during the Little Ice Age, so he like promulgates in a pamphlet, in a lot of series of different pamphlets saying, I want a chicken in every pot, right? That he wants to feed the people of France. He's going to have new roads and canals built to increase the infrastructure. He's going to lower taxes deliberately on poorer population and the poorer populations of France, and this is going to earn him that moniker, Henry the Great, right? Because he does a lot of things to help them out. Now, an interesting little thing, though, that some of you are probably thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute. What king has ever grown their power by lowering taxes? That doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense. Well, it's more along the lines of who he's lowering them on. He lowered taxes on the poor and impoverished because of the Little Ice Age and the famines that were being caused. And he also replaces it with a new form of taxation. A taxation form known as the paulette, right? Paulette is not a name, it's a type of tax, right? And what this is basically Henry IV started selling royal offices, right? He started being like, oh, are you a wealthy family? Would you like to buy into an office? Would you like to then pass that office down to your sons and make it hereditary? Whether it be tax assessor, magistrate, judge, certain types of bishoprics. Like if you could be a bishop, you could actually sell the office of a bishopric because ever since Francis I and they could appoint their own bishops. Like you could actually sell the office of bishopric to somebody else and a family would actually be able to lock it up for a certain time period. Now, when he does this, he actually creates a new type of nobility in France, and they call themselves the nobles of the robe, right? Or robe nobles, if you want to call it that. But it ends up making him a ton of money so he can go off and fight some other wars should he need to, right? But the big thing that's going to end up happening to Henry is by the end of his reign, he rules for about like 20-ish years, give or take. And what's going to end up happening, though, is by 1610, he is assassinated, right? He does not die a natural death. He's actually stabbed to death by a Catholic cardinal, right? Or no, like a Catholic fanatic, right? A Catholic fanatic dives into his carriage head first through the window and stabs him to death, right? Now, what ends up happening, though, is his young son king, not son king, ooh, no, whoa, don't get confused with that. Sorry, pretend I didn't say that. Rewind it, cut it out, don't say that. His young son is going to become king. Some of you are like, why is him saying son king such a big deal? Because the other guy later on is going to be the son king, and he's very, very important, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, going into it, is you need to understand his very, very young son is going to be named Louis the 13th, right? So Louis the 13th is going to come to power, but the issue was that he was only 8 years old, right? He was only 8 years old, and he's going to be used like as a, well, not used, but he's gonna be viewed as a very, very weak king, right? His actual like advisor, his queen regent, was his mom, Marie de Medici, which we just said earlier is super annoying and not very smart, right? Like so, which is a very, very dangerous combination of things to be ruling for your young son, right? Marie de Medici is also going to use her young son to try and like curry some favor with the Austrians. He is going to actually get married to a woman named Anne of Austria by an arranged marriage and stuff like that. And another big thing that's going to happen is underneath his young reign, whenever he comes to power, he's going to come to power at 8, and then by 1614, they're having to call this big meeting, right? Known as the Estates General, because he's only 12 years old. What the Estates General is it's a meeting for an emergency crisis in France, right? And so in 1614, when Louis XIII comes to power, they have to call this Estates General, which is kind of like an emergency parliament. Now, with that, though, they do this to try and figure out taxation, how to keep the nobles from rioting and revolting, and doing a number of other different things as well. But also, a big thing is that the third estate in France wants to lower taxes, right? They just want to lower taxes on some of the people. But what ends up going down in this whole process is it really demonstrates and shows Marie de Medici's weaknesses, right? She's not a very good queen regent. She's actually kind of manipulative as well, and she's trying to get like Louis XIII to only listen to what she says. And a lot of other nobles start whispering into Louis XIII's ear, and what ends up happening eventually is Maria de Medici is actually exiled out of the city by a young King Louis when he comes to the age of 13 years old, right? And so what ends up happening, though, is a despondent Louis, who's now exiled his mother and stuff like that, is actually going to have to turn to somebody to be his advisor. Because what 13-year-old is going to be a good king, right? And the guy he turns to is none other than Cardinal Richelieu, the real true leader during Louis XIII's reign, right? So when Louis XIII comes to power, he's very, very weak. He's easily manipulated, and he's also easily manipulated by his mom, right? Actually, at one point, Marie de Medici, they got back together for a little while. Louis XIII, actually started talking to his mom, Marie de Medici, again for a little while. And there was this really, really famous event in 1630 called the Day of the Dupes. And, dupes means, stupid people. And what ended up happening is Marie de Medici, first of all, only reason that she was allowed to talk to Louis XIII again is because Cardinal Richelieu convinced him to be like, hey, look, man, it's your mom, you know what I mean? Maybe y'all can mediate this and figure it out. And then Marie de Medici shows back up and it's just like, well, Cardinal Richelieu's a big stupid head and you should listen to me instead of him. And then, Louis XIII exiled or got rid of Cardinal Richelieu for less than a day. Did it for less than a day and then was like, I'm just kidding, I'm sorry. So that's how weak Louis XIII was. Cardinal Richelieu, on the other hand, is a very, very strong leader, right? Very pragmatic, very, very smart, wildly intelligent, has been a bishop since a very, very young age because his family is one of those Paulette families, right? Their family actually owned the bishopric for, of this one area in, Laurent or something like that, or some city in France. And so what ends up happening, though, is Cardinal Richelieu comes to power as Louis XIII's chief minister, right? And when he comes to power, he starts a series of different reforms to try and give Louis as much power, by default also giving himself more power. Because in the long run, when you want to make the argument, Cardinal Richelieu was the real king of France during this time period of French history, not so much Louis. Because Louis was focusing on something else. By the time Louis got to about 20 years old and he's now married to this woman named Anne of Austria, he's focusing mostly on trying to have a child. Because they keep trying to have kids over and over and over and over and over again, and they keep having miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage after failed pregnancy after death of a child following the birth. And so he's really focused on trying to keep the Bourbon dynasty going and trying to just be not the worst king on the planet. And so Cardinal Richelieu was really ruling for him instead. He comes to power, and of course, during this entire process, while Louis XIII was king of France, the 30 Years' War has now begun, right? 8 years into his rulership, when Louis XIII was 16 years old, is when the 30 Years' War is going to start in 1618. Now, looking at it as well, the 30 Years' War is going to be raging, of course, for its first two phases, the Bohemian and Danish one, mostly isolated away in the Holy Roman Empire. But of course, Cardinal Richelieu, seeing the Catholic forces in the first two phases of the 30 Years' War gaining too much power and getting too many victories, it's not that he doesn't like that they're Catholic victories, he doesn't like that they're Habsburg victories, right? And so this actually becomes a very, very big moment in his entire tenure as chief minister of the entire French government, because he becomes commander of France during that 30 Years' War. And he starts deliberately funding those Protestant armies under Gustavus Adolphus to try and weaken the Habsburg family and give France more power and kind of reassort that kind of balance of power, right? Now, in this whole process, Cardinal Richelieu becomes very, very popular in France, but very unpopular everywhere else, right? And another big reason why he becomes so popular in France is because he's trying to give more power to the king, right? A lot of locals and very regular people and the middle class and merchants and guild workers and traders were really, really disgusted with how much power the nobles had, right? They didn't like how much power the nobles had because they were like, look, if I'm going to be ruled over by somebody, I'd rather it be a good Machiavellian king. Honestly, Richelieu is very Machiavellian in a sense. They were like, I'd rather be ruled over by somebody like that than be ruled over by somebody like my noble who could change at any minute and then also who is also just not a good leader and is not very smart, right? So the thing about it is, what Cardinal Richelieu comes along to do is he decides to try and replace the power of the nobles with a new system. And he creates this thing known as the intendant system, right? The intendant system is basically a setup network, a bureaucratic multi-level government setup network where every single region of France would have what's known as an intendant, right? And the intendants would do whatever the king told them to do, right? Giving a crap load of power to the Bourbon monarchy and to the monarchs at the time, right? The intendant system also went against an old system that already existed in France known as the parlements, which sound like the most French thing you've ever heard of in your entire life. Parlement. And some of you are like, don't you mean parliament? No, I mean parlement, because that's what they called it. And you don't want it to get confused with the British Parliament, right? So the big thing about it, though, is the intendant system actually went directly against the parlements, because what was the parlements? The parlements were these councils of nobles that actually wrote everything the king said into law, basically giving the parlements a little bit of power over the king, because they could just choose not to listen to them and be like, oh, we didn't write it today, we'll write it next week. Oh, we didn't write it today, we'll write it next week. And so what ends up happening, though, is the intendants carry the word of the king directly to the people, rather than depending on the parlements to write these laws into power, right? So what he's going to do also is he's going to destroy Protestant communities. He's going to go and wage war directly on the city of La Rochelle, and in this very, very famous painting of him, he's just being an absolute boss, right? Known as the Crimson, like, wait, what was he called? What was he called? Like, he was like the Crimson Bishop or something like that. He had a nickname because of that red robe that he wore all the time. Richelieu, Crimson. All right, so Crimson nickname. All right, so, like, what was his nickname? Sorry, I had to look it up. He was known as his Red Eminence, right? Red Eminence because of the red robe that he wore. And look at him right now just crossing his arms and watching the destruction of a French city, right? Like, he literally is destroying the French city of La Rochelle because the Huguenot nobles there were gaining too much power, and he wanted to install intendants and also prevent and expel the English intervention. So an interesting little thing is that these are English boats out in the water that are trying to help Protestants in La Rochelle. And this dude doesn't even care. And he's got literally these, like, these bishops over here holding his hat for him while he watches the city get destroyed. This dude is aggressive. He sides with Adolphus to weaken the Habsburgs, and in the entire process, he even picks all of the people that hang out with Louis XIII firsthand, picks his friends for him so they will advance the powers of the king rather than the powers of the nobles. He also, multiple times, people try to assassinate him, like multiple different times, but the only reason that no one ever gets to him or assassinates him is because he has a network of spies inside of the royal court that will actually keep him safe. And that raises the question, is Cardinal Richelieu like a good or a bad guy? It's really, really hard to actually kind of make that decision because he like killed a bunch of his own people, but he also weakened the Habsburgs, and he also like sided with Gustavus Adolphus, which was a very, very big Protestant leader who was going to come along and try to like tip the like balance of power. But then he also kind of supplanted the power of the king at the exact same time. So it's a very, very interesting little thing. And also, fun fact, the front of his face was stolen at one point. So when he died eventually in 1642, this is actually his face. They actually took his head off of his like body, mummified it, and then replaced it and buried him with it. But in the French Revolution, someone stole it. And they eventually got it back in the 1890s and stuff like that. But that is literally Cardinal Richelieu's mummified head that was stolen during the French Revolution. Now, the other interesting thing that's going on right now as well is that what is going on? We need to understand this. We've got multiple different types of nobles, right? So something that we need to understand really quickly. I just earlier was talking about Henry IV and the creation of the robe nobility, right? Well, let's chat really, really quickly about what the difference between these robe nobles and sword nobles that Cardinal Richelieu is trying to weaken their power, right? So the robe nobles are the ones who bought their way into office. They're like the new guys on the streets. They are not based in tradition. They purchased an office, and that's how they were allowed to have it. It was a one-time payment, and they actually were allowed to collect taxes and actually do all these other different things, and were very prominent figures throughout most of European or French history. Now, why are they so powerful? Due to the fact that they have a very large, prestigious position in society. They can help collect taxes, and they don't pay much of them at all. Now, what about the sword nobles? The sword nobles are the other type of nobility that hates the idea that the power of the king is growing at all. They are not fans of this whatsoever because sword nobles earned their nobility through military service to the king, right? They earned their nobility through military service, and they didn't want to give up any of their power, right? But why are they so powerful? Because they control militaries. Well, the thing about it is Richelieu is going to reduce their power, and the intendants are going to cut out much of that power, and Richelieu is going to replace many of them in court with lower-ranked robe. Now, some of you are saying, wait a minute, Mr. Terry. Are you saying that the robe nobles were used to replace all the sword nobles? It's kind of a little bit of both, right? It's a little bit hard to explain, but basically what was going on is that there were some super powerful robe nobles by this point because this office was created in like the 1600s by Henry IV, right? So by this point in history, by 50 years later, there were some super powerful robe nobles and some really powerful sword nobles. And so what Richelieu's going to do is he's going to replace all those powerful nobles with just fresh off the street robe nobles that have just bought their way into office and have been lower ranked. We talked about this a little bit in class yesterday when we were discussing like, oh, replace a powerful noble with a weaker noble and the noble's power will be dependent on the king, right? So the big thing about it though in general is that Richelieu is going to replace the powerful robe nobles and sword nobles with a lot of these weaker robe nobles that are coming along a little bit later. Now really quickly though, what's going to end up happening as well is that Richelieu and Louis XIII are going to die within a year of each other, right? It's almost like Louis XIII just couldn't do his job without the guy, right? In 1642, Richelieu is going to die, and his face is going to be mummified, and all that stuff's going to happen. But then 1643, Louis XIII is going to die, leaving this little chunky chunk child on the throne, like to do, what are you doing? There we go. To do his bidding, right? That right there is the most famous absolutist king that has ever existed. And his name is Louis the 14th, right? Louis Dudon is what his name actually is, right? So like Dudon means gift of God. And some of you are like, but wait a minute, I thought Louis the 13th couldn't have had kids. They finally had one successfully, right? Him and his wife, Anne of Austria, finally got together and had one surviving child. And they named him Louis Dudon due to the fact that Dudon means gift of God, right? Like so, and Louis Dudon comes to power at the age of 4. Like 4 years old, he becomes king after the death of his father, Louis the 13th. But the thing about it is, just like Louis the 13th, this guy can't rule. He's 4 years old. So who's going to rule instead? Well, who's going to rule is his mom, Anne of Austria, who's way better and way better of a ruler than Marie de Medici was. Very smart, very pragmatic, and then also he's going to have another chief minister. The one that was trained by Cardinal Richelieu, named Cardinal Mazarin. Now, I have a little heart right here because word on the street is that these two were hooking up, right? Like, so there's a word on the street that these two were actually had a very nefarious relationship and all this other stuff going on. But what we're going to do is we're going to cut the flip right there, and we're going to talk a lot about the Sun King and stuff like that, Louis Dudon, and his rise to power and class. But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.